Well, it's that time of year again, the only one that really matters. I've been so excited to make a seasonal video, not just so I can wear a jumper and decorate my desk, but also because it's the first Christmas since I started this channel, and talking about the Doctor Who Christmas specials feels like a sort of rite of passage. But I've had no idea what special I wanted to talk about. In my schedule for weeks I've just had something Christmassy written, so I thought I'd watch them all, and I'm here to talk about them.
There's been a lot of discussion this year about how important it is for the show to have a yearly special on the 25th, and how necessary it is for a Christmas episode to be, well, Christmassy. So I thought it would be worth considering just how festive the existing 13 specials are, and whether that has any correlation with the quality. So on top of the mini reviews I've written for them all, I've decided to also award them each a score out of 5 for Christmassiness. These aren't numerical scores for quality because that's not really my style, they're just very subjective ways of measuring just how Christmassy these specials are. So without any further ado, let's deck the halls. Is that what deck the halls means? I don't know. We're gonna do it.
We'll start with the 5 specials of the Russell T Davies era, the ones that turned Doctor Who into such a staple of British Christmas tradition. It was a period of the show that shone a spotlight on the mundane human experience, with relationships and families brought into the forefront. So, unsurprisingly, that's where a lot of the focus was when it came to the Christmas specials, and it all started with the Christmas Invasion.
No, hold on. Oh, I know. Merry Christmas!
It's quite remarkable that this story is as good as it is. It had the incredibly difficult task of being the first post-regeneration story and Christmas special of the revival. So many people in the audience were being shown their first new incarnation, and people can be very quick to dismiss things that are different. The team took the incredible risk of having the brand new Doctor be unconscious for most of the episode. I love a Doctor Light story, but it's bold for it to be the first introduction we get for him. But I think it works especially well. We are so desperate to get to know this new Doctor that we pay really close attention to him when he's up and about, and it helps that all of those times are fantastic. David Tennant and the writers seem to have immediately decided what they were going to do with this Doctor and conveyed it perfectly. It's just so fun to watch. When he steps out of the TARDIS at the 40-minute mark, he absolutely dominates the screen with the energy he brings. It's very apparent that he's still the Doctor, and they nailed it right from his introduction. But before that moment, Billie Piper is the one who really carries the episode. I think it's probably one of Rose's best stories, if not the best. She's really good as the audience insert, with her reactions to the main character's sudden change mirroring the viewers. It's why I think regenerations are better when there's a companion there to adjust with us. As for the rest of the episode, we get the welcome return of Harriet Jones and Unit fighting the Sycorax, who are pretty okay villains. They're not the greatest by any means, but they look pretty good and they're quite memorable. They're not the focus, so we don't really need anything too special. And of course, we also have Mickey and Jackie, who are always lovely to see, and they both have great moments. On that note, I have to say that it's a very Christmassy Christmas special. Not only on the surface level, with the evil Christmas trees and Santas with guns and Christmas songs, but on a deeper level, with the recognisable but indescribable warmth and atmosphere of the holidays. The Christmas spirit, if you will. The Christmas dinner at the end just fills me with such joy. I always love seeing Doctor Who characters just hanging out and having fun, and this is probably one of the best examples we have of that. We also get Song for 10, which would have made the whole episode worth it anyway.
So for the festive score, I will be giving Christmas Invasion 5 David Tennants out of 5. It's just such a wonderful way to spend an hour. There's a great mix between the feeling of familiarity and that it's the start of something new. It's just a shining example of what made this era so special. What a great start.
What? What?
Who are you? But where am I?
What?
What the hell is this place?
What?
Now, this is an interesting one. I think this might be a really unpopular opinion, but I don't love The Runaway Bride. I think it's a mid to low tier Russell T Davies story that stands out thanks to the inclusion of Donna Noble. And don't get me wrong, I think she was brilliant. With hindsight, we know she was brilliant, but having a special like this with a one-off celebrity companion was quite the risk. I've said before that Christmas specials are great for guest stars, and she was the one who started the trend. So obviously, I'm glad that the episode happened, and I'm even more glad that she was brought back full time, but I'm still not overly fussed about her debut. There are no elements that I actively dislike. The Emperor of the Rachnos looks good and gives a sufficiently hammy performance, but I don't think she's anything special. I think the most interesting thing the episode is doing is acting as an epilogue to Doomsday. The Doctor's grief at the loss of Rose is palpable, notably in the scene we get with the new Neil Hannon song Love Don't Roam, but we also get a sense throughout the whole thing that he needs to be travelling with someone. This was something that was made retroactively more impactful by Turn Left, which showed that had Donna not been there to stop him, he would have died killing the Ragnos. That stuff is all pretty good, and the episode is not without its other fun moments, but the overall package leaves me a little bit cold. And speaking of cold, one of the most important things I noticed about it was just how un-Christmassy it felt. They mentioned the fact that it's Christmas Eve here and there, but it's easy to forget. They also directly lift a lot of concepts from the previous year's special, like the robot Santas and the evil decorations. I'm all for callbacks, but this feels more like they didn't have the confidence to deviate from the Christmas invasion. It gives me really early winter, like September kind of vibes. Like they wrote a regular episode and slapped a coat of Christmas paint onto it.
Open the door! I can't, it's locked! Santa's a robot!
This was to such an extent that I researched the production of the episode to see whether that was the case, and lo and behold, it was.
Get it, guys? Santa's a robot. Does this look enough like the unmasked pilotfish for the joke to work, or do I just look like a clone trooper in a onesie? I think it's the latter. Alright, I'll come out of it. Okay. I'm going to give Runaway Bride 2 Christmas David Tennants out of 5, and maybe that's even a tad generous. It just really doesn't feel festive to me at all. It's not a bad special by any means, it gave us a lot of great things, it just doesn't do a whole lot for me. Oh well.
Voyage of the Damned broke the tradition of setting Christmas stories on Earth, and gave us one that followed the pretty conventional Doctor Who setup of a spaceship or space station where things are going wrong. But the fact it's 70 minutes long means we get a lot more downtime at the start before anything happens. It means we have enough scenes to learn and begin to care about the ensemble cast. This is probably why the episode works so well, because every death feels like a loss. It's no surprise that a lot of fans can still remember all the characters in this episode, unlike the majority of supporting cast who end up rather forgettable. What also helps in this aspect is that there's not really a companion. The Doctor starts the episode on his own with no one to talk to except the other guests, which allows for some really nice characterization as he gets to know Morvin, Foon, and Mr. Copper. I think this is another defining episode for David Tennant. It almost goes without saying, but he is just outstanding. When remembering his era, his moments with companions and friends are so often the focus, but this just shows how great he is even on his own. Over the course of it, we actually do get a sort of companion in the form of Astrid Peth, brought to life so adorably by Kylie Minogue. Her character is from a planet that's more aware of aliens and space travel, so it gives her an interesting perspective. She spent her life longing for a new sky, and her excitement when they visit London allows the Doctor to see the city through her eyes. She really would have been such a perfect companion, but this doesn't mean that the fact she dies feels like a missed opportunity. If anything, it just adds to how tragic it is. The rest of the cast are brilliant. Mr. Copper's nonsense about Earth is a highlight for me, but everyone has their moment to shine. On top of the main gang, we also have the Captain, Alonzo, and Wilf, who all made quite big impressions for such minor characters. 2 of them were even brought back. We also get some fun meta-commentary on the frequency with which aliens invade at Christmas, and I always appreciate that. The baddies in the episode are angels, which was a bold choice after introducing the much more iconic weeping ones in an earlier episode, but these ones are luckily much sillier, and I just find them so funny.
Information killed.
All in all, Voyage of the Damned is a great Doctor Who story. It's a silly camp romp, but it's executed so well, and despite being set in space, it manages to feel more authentically Christmassy than the special that came before it. It just has the warm, cozy vibes that I'm looking for. So I'll be giving this one 4 Christmas David Tennants out of 5.
Now let's move on to the next Doctor. Not Matt Smith, but David Morrissey. I didn't really think much of this story when I first saw it, but I knew from the opening of this rewatch that I was in for a treat. The Doctor is once again on his own, just taking in an adorable Victorian market, soaking up those wholesome and comfy Christmas vibes, just as we are with him. Soon after that, we meet David Morrissey's Doctor, a character I think is the real star of the show. He gives such a superb performance, bringing to life a very creative and well-written character. Although he's not a real Doctor, he feels like one, and easily could have been a spectacular incarnation. His attitude and interaction with the 10th Doctor gives me really fun multi-Doctor story vibes. But I'm almost glad he wasn't a real Doctor because it meant we got this wonderful, unique story about him. I've said before that 10 in this story feels relegated to a supporting character role, and I really don't want that to be taken in a bad way. He suits it really well. It's not properly Doctor Light like Blink or Love and Monsters, but he feels like a side character in a Jackson Lake story for the first half. And I do wish it had been that way for the whole episode, because it becomes a bit more of a one-dimensional Cyberman story once we find out the truth about Jackson Lake and the real Doctor takes charge. The Cybermen and Miss Hartigan are fine. They fill their roles as generic stompy robots and the naive human they betray well enough. The Cyber King is appropriately stupid for a Christmas special. I must say I kind of like the steampunk design and think they missed an opportunity for a full Victorian Cyberman redesign. The best parts of the climax and the latter half of the story are the emotional beats relating to Jackson Lake. It's really hard-hitting for a Christmas special, but it's never too miserable. We get quite a happy ending. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention Rosita, a very underrated part of the episode. She has a very natural dynamic with David Morrissey that makes me wish we saw a little bit more of them together. But his chemistry with David Tennant is probably just as good, so I'm glad we got that. There's also a decent amount of action in this story. I've been really critical of that kind of thing before because I feel like it's never any good and usually just detracts from what really matters. But it brings a real energy and excitement to this story and makes it feel rather cinematic. I think if they ever did make another Doctor Who movie, it should be along these lines in scale. I know I've already mentioned him, but I have to reiterate that Jackson Lake is just one of the best characters the show has ever had. As a doctor, as a broken man, and as a hopeful father. David Morrissey is superb, and he's really what makes the episode. But David Tennant does his job of guiding him out of the trauma really well. It's a genius idea that didn't lose itself in how clever it was being, and focused more on the emotional side of it, and that was the right call. I think it's one of the most beautiful stories the show has ever told. It's also one of the Christmassiest Christmas specials. I'll admit that it could mostly be thanks to the setting. It's very Dickensian, with orphans and Christmas and markets and all sorts. Where I live, there's a Victorian festival of Christmas every year, and I've just fallen in love with that aesthetic. It also just kinda reminds me of my favourite Christmas film, A Muppet's Christmas Carol, so it definitely does have a head start. But, as I'll come on to later, a Victorian winter doth not a festive episode make, so this story clearly has a little bit more going on.
The next Doctor obviously gets 5 out of 5 on the Christmas scale. It has such a wonderful spark of magic and kindness to it that I can't quite put into words. And I keep coming across concepts in this video that I'm not able to describe, and it makes me think I shouldn't be writing these reviews. But I just love these stories and I want to talk about how much I love them. But when my response is so much more emotional than critical, I don't know how to say it. I just want to shout, "It's great!"
Now we come on to the last of the David Tennant and Russell T Davies era specials.
For Gallifrey. For victory! For victory! For the end of time itself!
The End of Time is the only Christmas special to be a two-parter, which means the part that aired on Christmas Day is quite hard to judge because it's incomplete. So I'll be occasionally mentioning part 2, but focusing mostly on the Christmas bit. It's quite a polarizing story, and I think it's because it has so much going on. Arguably too much going on. And the thing is, some of it is really great, and some of it is really bad. No, actually, a better description is that a lot of it is really great, and a lot of it is really bad. There's just so much. I think on top of the fact it's juggling a lot, it also has insane pacing, especially in part 1. Everything happens at once, and then nothing happens for a significant amount of time. In the first 19 minutes, we're shown the Ood, told about the Doctor dying and everyone having bad dreams, told that Wilf is the only one who remembers them, given a look at the Immortality Gate and the Cactus Scientists, introduced to a cult of baddies who are trying to revive the Master with magic spells from the mystical Book of Saxon, and we're reintroduced to Harold Saxon's wife and told that she's been working on the antidote to Saxon's revival. There's a mysterious woman in Wilf's telly, and Obama has a plan to fix the economy. So after being shown all that in such quick succession, we then get an extended scene of the Master sniffing the Doctor, hitting a barrel, and being chased around a quarry using his new superpowers. It's absolutely bizarre. We have some really lovely character stuff with the Doctor and Wilf, and the Doctor and the Master, but it's always followed by more ridiculousness.
It's real. It's real. It's real!
It can't seem to go on for too long without doing something stupid. But for all the rubbish, I have to give them credit for the restraint they showed by only including Donna in such a small role. Her being there really improved the episode, but they didn't fall into the temptation of having her be properly back. And in fitting with the Russell T Davies tradition of relatable family Christmases, Sylvia Noble is a funny addition.
Dad, what are you up to?
Get out of here. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. But she can't see you. What if she remembers?
As ridiculous and frustrating as the first half is, the second half does bring it together in a way that ends up mostly working, and that is quite impressive. But it's still nowhere near the best episode for David Tennant. It's absolutely my least favourite for John Sim. I think Wilf is what saves the whole thing. He simultaneously elevates and grounds it. He's such a delightful presence throughout the whole thing and is really one of the best companions the show has ever had. Without him, I think the story would have completely fallen apart into miserable stupidity. But with him there, it somehow manages to be kind of great. In an action-packed and lore-heavy story, the moments where David Tennant really shines are when he's just talking to Wilf. As far as the all-important Festive rating goes, it's probably the second least Christmassy special of the Russell T Davies era, and I think I know why. So many of the best Christmas moments in these specials come in the ending, and the ending of this story didn't happen at Christmas, so we don't get a huge amount of Christmas downtime after they've defeated the baddie. It definitely feels like it is Christmas, but there's just too much happening to be able to take in any comfy Christmas vibes like we had in the other three. I think I'll give it 3 David Tennants out of 5.
So that's it for the Russell T Davies era specials. I think it's fair to say that they were pretty great overall, and you can see why the format stuck around. We move on now to the first half of Stephen Moffat's Christmases, the ones with the 11th Doctor. This was an era of the show that was committed to telling the fairy tale of the madman with a box, so Christmas seemed like a perfect fit. Let's see whether it was.
We start with the 2010 special, the first to star Matt Smith. It shows us right away that this ain't your older brother's Christmas episode. Who wants to see Christmas dinner on Earth? That's where we are. We're instantly given another planet with a weird, swirly sky, distancing itself from the relatable, everyday situations we'd come to expect, but leaning into the familiar Victorian Christmas imagery we'd expect from a Dickens adaptation. Oh yeah, this is a Dickens adaptation, sort of. The Doctor in-universe is fully aware of the story of Scrooge, and uses it as the basis of his plan to change Kazran's mind and save the lives of the people crashing down to the planet. I just love the moment when he realises he knows exactly what to do.
So, that ship needs to land, but it can't land unless a very bad man suddenly decides to turn nice just in time for Christmas Day.
Doctor, I can't hear you. What is that? Is that singing?
A Christmas Carol.
A what?
A Christmas Carol.
A what?
A Christmas Carol!
But at its core, it is a straight-up adaptation. It has the same spirit and heart and tells roughly the same story. It's a show about time travel with yearly Christmas episodes. A play on this classic story, however loose, was absolutely inevitable. And Moffat was the right guy for the job. He puts a unique spin on it, using time travel rather than ghosts, which leads to some genius ways of incorporating the past, the present, and especially the future. The final payoff is just so clever. It's also a really great episode for Matt Smith. I was worried at first because I found him kind of annoying at the start, like a parody of himself with a hint of Sherlock Holmes. I came to the conclusion that he really needed a companion. Amy and Rory are in the episode but in a very minimal role, but it seemed like 11 wasn't nearly as good as 10 at being on his own. Once he joins Kazran though, he's brilliant. He's obviously really silly, but I think this story is a great display of how capable and intelligent he is. He also just really works within the Christmas setting, as you'd assume he would. His role in the story of Kazran is perfect, and Matt Smith really shines once it gets going. But it is, when it comes down to it, the story of Kazran, and it's a fantastic story. Michael Gambon is absolutely sensational. He's the perfect Scrooge. I cannot imagine the episode working nearly so well if he wasn't so flawless. And the young Kazrans and Abigail all knock it out of the park. I think it's a really special episode, where a great script was given the opportunity to be realised so wonderfully, with absolutely no weak link in the production design, the cast, the score, and the direction.
It's a beautiful, hilarious, heartbreaking, and creative adaptation of the best Christmas story there is, and I think even with the changes it makes, it's still probably the second best Christmas Carol film ever made, after the one with this guy. It's just such a stellar example of how Doctor Who and Christmas can work so well together, and it absolutely deserves 5 Matt Smiths out of 5.
Continuing the trend of putting Doctor Who twists on famous stories at Christmas, The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe gave us a Narnia episode. Although, to be honest, the similarities it has with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe are quite surface level. They're the jumping off point for a story that goes in a very different direction. Surprisingly, A Christmas Carol, which seems to vastly differ from its source material, is much closer to its overall spirit and message. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just different. I really hated this story when I first watched it, and it's widely considered to be the worst of the specials. details, but I found myself enjoying it a lot more this time around. I think it may have just been that I'm getting into the Christmas spirit and I'm more forgiving, but I also think that the episode works much better in isolation. When we were desperate for a continuation of the Series 6 story, this seemed like an annoying detour. With hindsight, I didn't think it was nearly as bad. It got me on board very quickly with a really strong opening, then kept me on board with the scenes of the 11th Doctor and the children. My favourite stuff is when he's being a sort of Santa Claus-esque figure to them, deliberately overdoing it to distract the children from the tragedy. It's a lot of fun, and Matt Smith does it really well. But then when the conversation turns serious, he also absolutely nails it.
Because what's the point in them being happy now if they're going to be sad later? The answer is, of course, because they are going to be sad later.
I thought in the previous special that he really didn't do too well without a companion, but I think he proved me wrong in this one. He's actually doing some of his best work. But similar to the previous story, he is there as a supporting character in the story of Madge. And it's a story I quite like. Not only do we have Claire Skinner giving quite a good performance, Madge is actually quite well written. It's proof that Moffat is capable of writing his female characters well when he's not desperately horny for them. I appreciate how well she takes things into her stride, and doesn't put up with anyone being patronising towards her, even when she's technologically out of her depth. She's a lot of fun, and she's part of a demographic that we don't usually see represented on the show. I think what lets the story down is a weak second act. The stuff with Bill Bailey doesn't do anything for me, and there's also just a lot of walking in the woods trying to unravel a mystery that isn't really being kept secret. It starts well, and then begins to really drag. But what was different about my experience with this rewatch is that I felt it came out on the other side again and was good. The emotional climax really worked for me this time, with Madge saving the day and Reg following her home one last time, followed by the scene where she convinces the Doctor to finally go and see Amy and Rory for Christmas, leading to what I think is one of the nicest and most wholesome scenes in the show's history. Oh, and Moffat is really keeping things up on the festivity score. Another one of the Christmassiest Christmases. The Doctor just feels like an insane Santa coming along to save Christmas for the children, and it's topped off really nicely by the fact that it's actually their mum who saves it. 4 out of 5 Matt Smiths for the Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe. And a thumbs up overall for a universally hated special.
I said I'd feed you. I didn't say who to.
We now move on to the Snowmen. This was actually the first special I watched at the time it aired. I'm relatively new to the show, so obviously I have loads of nostalgia for it. Actually, no, I don't seem to have any at all. I don't care about it, and I don't care for it. It's really weird that I find this story so unremarkable because there are actually lots of things I like about it. Victorian Clara is great. I think she has a lot more personality than Series 7 Clara. Between her and Rosita, this watch through has definitely convinced me that we need a Victorian Cockney companion as soon as possible. And the twist of killing her off at the end is relatively interesting. Every time there's a new character who says she's going to travel with the Doctor, we know she probably won't. But this time we knew Jenna Coleman was going to be the next companion, so it was quite unexpected when this character wasn't. Unfortunately, the episode does lose that one bit of interesting storytelling with hindsight. We also have Strax, Vastra, and Jenny, who are usually quite hit and miss, but absolutely hit in this story. They all have at least 1 or 2 funny lines. And the Doctor himself is quite good. He became quite depressed after the first half of Series 7. I think we all did.
That was funny.
And Matt Smith does the recluse stuff quite well. In typical depressed Doctor fashion, he pretends he doesn't care and won't get involved, but absolutely no one is fooled. So with all these positive elements, why is it that the episode falls flat? I think it's because after the companion introduction, everything apart from the characterization is really naff. The stuff with the Snowmen is rubbish, they're not scary at all, and they're not funny enough to be interesting either. Richard E. Grant and Ian McKellen are incredibly unremarkable as the villains, which is insane because that casting should have led to the greatest baddie pairing of all time, but there's just nothing to them, except a mildly interesting connection to classic Who, and the whole thing is paced very poorly, so it just turns into a bit of a slog. This was the first of the Moffat specials to not adapt a classic tale, and I have a sneaking suspicion that this was originally not the case. It seems every now and then like it's trying to be a Doctor Who take on Sherlock Holmes. With multiple references to the detective and a similar setup of an emotionally shut-off genius being joined by a more human companion. I would have liked to have seen that side of the story explored a bit more, especially since turning Richard E. Grant's boring Doctor character into a proper Moriarty figure would have been so much more interesting. But obviously and understandably, Moffat was a tad Sherlocked out. But without an element like it, this story just has a bit of an identity crisis and becomes pretty forgettable and uninteresting. So, although it's not without a few positives, The Snowmen is just not fun to watch. Honestly, I have no intention of ever watching it again. Why would I bother when there are so many better stories to choose from?
On top of that, it's not even very Christmassy at all. Even the Victorian aesthetic couldn't save it on that front. It's wintry, sure, there's snow, there are boring snowmen, but the spirit of Christmas is horribly absent. 1 out of 5 Matt Smiths. Maybe even 0.
And now it's time for one last bow. Like all your other selves, 11's hour is over now. The clock is striking 12's.
Time of the Doctor was a weird one. It feels like Moffat's equivalent of End of Time, even though it wasn't the end of his era. He brings back so many of the ideas and concepts from his first 3 series in an attempt to tie them all up. It's the first time we had a big fan-servicey send-off for a Doctor that wasn't also the send-off for the showrunner, and it really splits the Smith and Capaldi eras into 2 distinct sections, unlike the transition from Eccleston to Tennant where a number of things carried over both tonally and from a story perspective. So yeah, you probably guessed from my comparison to End of Time that this wasn't my favourite story. I'll say that the setup, while convoluted and tricky for a Christmas Day audience to follow, is quite a good one, although I'll admit that me and my uncle had no idea what was going on when we first watched it 7 years ago. It has a lot of promise, and so many of the ideas that are briefly touched on could have been great, but there's just not enough room in this story to wrap up the silence will fall when the question is asked thread in a satisfying way. The pieces are all there, but there's no meaningful effort to bring them all together. A lot of major plot points are just mentioned in a line or two. Stephen Moffat wanted to dedicate a whole series to this story, and it shows. We know from End of Time that an increased runtime wouldn't have necessarily made it feel less cramped, but I don't think it would have hurt either. There's just too much going on and not enough time spent on developing anything, so it ends up falling pretty flat overall. I think my favourite aspect of the story is probably Clara. Once the show moved on from the Impossible Girl arc, they realised they had their hands on a really great companion, and I'm glad her potential was realised in later stories. It's a pretty good episode for the 11th Doctor as well. It's not the worst send-off he could have had, especially considering that his character at that point had devolved into a cartoon parody of himself. Although I will say that the Doctor goes to what he thinks is his last stand very nonchalantly. Obviously, as an audience, we never think he's actually going to die, but I don't think the episode believes in it either, especially when you compare it to something like The Doctor Falls, where the stakes were taken so seriously that even we felt like it was the end. And I don't love the regeneration. The speech is just a bit too much, I think. So overall, Time of the Doctor was a pretty unsuccessful attempt to wrap up 3 series worth of storytelling, but it's not horribly unpleasant to watch. This may sound like damning with faint praise, and it is, but I don't hate it. And I've got to give Moffat credit where it's due. It's not a great story, but you can't deny that it looks and feels as Christmassy as it gets. There's an adorable town called Christmas where the Doctor fixes toys. Moffat brings in an element I thought we'd never see in his era, the relatable human Christmas dinner. A crossover between the fairy tale story of the Doctor and Clara's family life adds an interesting dynamic, with Moffat's most extensive foray into the world of families. And I have to say, Clara's Nan is a gem.
Are we playing Twister now?
So I give it 4 Christmas Matt Smiths out of 5, even if the marks I'd give it for quality would be much lower.
And so ends the Matt Smith Christmases. He was a Doctor who worked so well with the festive vibes that it's a shame he only had one great Christmas special. Oh well. We now move on to the final era of the show where Christmas was still a thing. Peter Capaldi's.
We'll start with his first Christmas, Last Christmas. It seems like the Moff wanted to do a Santa episode but didn't want to make it a straight up Santa story. So he did what any sane writer would do and made a Christmas themed mashup of Alien and Inception. And it's probably the best possible thing he could have done. I can't think of a better use for Santa in Doctor Who than his role in this story. Stephen Moffat is absolutely mental, but he's also a genius and I miss him. While we're praising Moffat, telepathic facehuggers who home into their own image in someone else's brain are so scary. A monster you can't think about defeating without making the situation worse. It's a brilliant idea and could have been the basis of a great horror episode. The next Blink even. But they're not the focus. Don't think I mean this in a bad way at all. I really respect Moffat for coming up with such a great concept and deciding to spend more time developing the characters. And the way he does that is through the Crab's ability to induce dreams. The dream aspect allows for some of the best character stuff in Capaldi's era. At the time it released, it was the most touching and interesting look at his relationship with Clara that we'd ever had. I was wondering why previous stories hadn't been as good as this one for developing the relationship between the Doctor and the companion, and I realised that this is actually a really unusual Christmas special, because it's about an established Doctor and companion pairing having an adventure together. It's the only Christmas special where that's the case. The majority of stories were setting up new Doctors or new companions or had existing companions there but separate to the main action. Last Christmas is really just a regular episode that is also a Christmas special, and it really works. I guess if we want to be fussy, Clara Clara had left and this is her reintroduction, but they hadn't even had one episode apart and they fall right back into the 12-Clara relationship. It's really great to see because it has a level of continuity that other stories don't. There's often a hesitation to directly address the events of the previous series, but they devote a decent amount of time grappling with the loss of Danny Pink, again most notably using the Dream Crab sequence. Also thanks to the Dream Crabs, we get Nick Frost as Santa Claus, which is absolutely perfect casting. He's young but has just the right energy, and of course he'd end up bickering with the Doctor, they're pretty much the same person.
Santa Claus does not do the scientific explanation.
Alright, as the Doctor might say, oh, it's all about dreamy women.
Why don't you just go and make him a naughty list?
I have, mate, and you're on it.
Don't give me that look. You're supposed to be warm and friendly and cheerful.
Oh yeah, look at your great bedside manner.
Don't be so hostile.
Doctor.
On that note, this is definitely one of Peter Capaldi's best stories. He just seems so happy and warm in a way that isn't always there in his earlier stuff. And something I feel is constantly overlooked is how funny he is. He has so many hilarious lines in this episode. The whole story is one of the most creative and scary Christmas specials, but also so full of whimsical joy. It gave us terrifying face-hugging monsters eating Michael Troughton's brain, but it also gave us the Doctor flying Santa's sleigh.
It's really great. I don't have anything to complain about. It just works. Everything does. Obviously, it gets 5 out of 5 Christmas Capaldis for its festivity. How could it not? There's Santa, there's the North Pole, and there are some lovely seasonal vibes sprinkled in amongst the hellish horror. Ho ho ho.
Then we got something that felt inevitable in Moffat's last few years as showrunner. The return of Professor River Song. And what a return it was. River is superb in this episode. It's without a doubt the best she ever was. For starters, it's nice to see how she is when the Doctor isn't around, or at least when she thinks he's not. The Doctor is a side character in her adventure rather than the other way round. Honestly, at times it feels like an episode of a River Song spin-off, with her own supporting characters that the Doctor has never met. There are some lines and details about her life that are just so well thought out.
What meteor strike?
Alert. Meteor storm imminent.
That meteor strike.
How could you know?
I'm an archaeologist from the future.
I dug you up.
But we can't overlook the incredible chemistry Alex Kingston has with Peter Capaldi. It's a shame they only got one story because I find their dynamic so much more enjoyable than how she was with Matt Smith, even when she has no idea who he is. The Doctor is constantly attempting playful banter and it gets hilariously shut down. It's a fun parallel to the first time they met when he didn't know her, but a lot less depressing. We also get Greg Davies, who is clearly having the time of his life playing King Hydroflax, in one of the most unapologetically camp performances the show has ever had, and who could forget the introduction of beloved companion Nardole. It's another joyful Christmas with the 12th Doctor. He seems to be at his funniest in these specials. He really plays it up in a good way. It's so hard to place why he works so well with the vibes of a Christmas special, but he just seems so warm and kind. I guess he was the television equivalent of Santa Claus for a few years there. I'm surprised this episode isn't overwhelmingly praised as one of the 12th Doctor's best, if not just for the scene of him reacting to the TARDIS.
My entire understanding of physical space has been transformed! Three-dimensional Euclidean geometry has been torn up, thrown in the air, and snubbed to death!
Or the Hello Sweetie moment and everything that followed once she knew who the Doctor was. And I have to mention the music. It's been good in all the stories, but this is one of the only times it's used so emotionally, bringing back themes from the 11th Doctor's era to remind us of the times he had with River, as their time together comes to an end. And the singing towers themselves just sound breathtaking. Everything else that happens on Darillium is perfection. Gorgeous music, a stunning location, and a feeling of beautiful sadness. I just love it so much.
All anyone will ever tell you is that when the wind stands fair and the night is perfect, when you least expect it, but always when you need it the most. That is a song.
And they follow it up with a conversation about how happily ever after doesn't have to mean forever, that it can just mean time. We then get the joyful reveal that Nights on Darillium last 24 years. This is really one of my favourite moments in the show's history. I was honestly never even that much of a fan of their relationship, but this story really got me on board. And the fact they know it's their last night together really breaks my heart, especially because their timelines had synced up enough for this moment to be the end for both of them. There's a through line throughout Heaven Sent, Hell Bent and Husbands about things coming to an end, and how it doesn't have to just be sad, it can also be really beautiful. There's something bittersweet about all the 12th Doctor's Christmases. They're happy but sad. And I think that element of festive sadness is something that's often overlooked about the holiday season.
It's happy sad, as all endings are, I think. and also like Christmas, I think. Quite like Christmas. It's always a bit sad, isn't it?
And this final scene between River and the Doctor perfectly encapsulates that. It seems like I've spent the whole time gushing about one specific scene, but the whole episode is an enjoyable romp. It just happens to spend the last 15 minutes hitting you with one of the most satisfying and moving emotional beats we've ever had. I just love it.
There are far fewer festive elements to this story than others, but it's still somehow one of the most magical and Christmassy things I've ever seen. You may disagree, and Christmassiness is such an intangible concept that I don't quite know how I'd argue with you. It's just a feeling, and I feel it so strongly. 5 out of 5 Capaldi heads.
The Return of Dr Mysterio is something that felt inevitable, a Doctor Who twist on the superhero genre. It's the 21st century, it was bound to happen. Although this is more of a love letter to the classic superhero films than the modern day blockbusters. Moffat seems to have really been inspired by the Christopher Reeve Superman films, and the production design is attempting to emulate that, but I think the budget may be a tad too low for it to fully work. It feels a little bit like the CW superhero shows. But there's a bit of visual creativity in the phone call scene, which is laid out like a comic book. It would have been nice to see a little bit more of that. As for the story, it shouldn't work. Doctor Who and superheroes shouldn't go this well together, but I think the Doctor's attitude towards the genre really helps it work.
He was bitten by a radioactive spider, and guess what happened?
Radiation poisoning, I should think.
The superhero himself, the Ghost, is really fun. He's a kind of parody amalgamation of all the popular superheroes. I think it's really sold by the quality performance from Justin Chatwin, and Lucy is probably a better Lois Lane than the majority of real Lois Lanes. If the chemistry between her and the Ghost wasn't so good, I don't think the episode would work at all. I'd say this is also Nardol's first proper episode, at least the first time he's recognisable as the character we see in Series 10. He's got that sarcastic edge that was lacking in his debut. Bringing him back seemed like a terrible idea at the time, but I'm really glad they did. His relationship with the Doctor feels fresh and fun, and it's a shame we didn't get a little bit more time with just the two of them together.
Hey! Don't do that.
Sorry.
The baddies are pretty good. It's a creepy design with an effect that's executed quite well. And unlike a lot of alien invaders, they actually have a clever plan. It feels like a cross between a comic book supervillain plot and a Doctor Who one. World War III meets the Secret Invasion.
It's a good plan. I like it.
And it's cool that they were a minor part of the previous story. The whole thing ties into Husbands of River Song more than you'd think, actually. It seemed to me like an episode that would never be mentioned again, but the loss of River played a big part in how the Doctor was in this episode, and going forward. He revisits the through line that was present across the previous few stories of things ending being beautiful and sad, but adds the fact that things can begin again and that's happy, which is a great way to lead into the new beginnings of Series 10. Even the name, The Return of Dr Mysterio, while being a very superhero sounding story, is about his return. Not just from his happily ever after with River, but from the sadness he felt when it ended. It's good stuff. Oh, and I've been positive about this story so far, but it's one of the least Christmassy specials there is. It probably could have aired at any other time. 1 out of 5 Peter Capaldis. It's nothing spectacular, but it's really camp fun, and I enjoyed it from start to finish. And despite what you might think from the surface, it's not without some clever concepts and touching moments. If you haven't seen it since it came out, maybe give it another watch.
Dr. Mysterio.
So, Twice Upon a Time. You know, I really wish I could have ended this video with Husbands of River Song, but there's such a chronological nature to the development and stories of the specials that I had to go in order. So unfortunately, we're ending on somewhat of an anti-climax. Twice Upon a Time is a story that I have really complicated feelings about, but have already analysed in excruciating depth quite recently. I'll sum my thoughts up by saying it's a pretty enjoyable and emotional story that puts a hopeful spin on the grim situation we were left with at the end of Series 10. It's got a lot of great stuff and a lot of disappointing rubbish. I'm glad it exists, but I really wish it were better. For the final festive rating, I'll give Twice Upon a Time 3 out of 5 Peter Capaldis. If you want to know more, check out my video. If you don't, that's okay too.
I would recommend watching it though. I think it's quite good, although I could be biased because it's got me in it.
So that's it, all 13 of the specials. Now it's time to rank them. At number 13, I put the Snowmen, and there's really no surprise there. In 12th place, I put Time of the Doctor, and I'm ready to be crucified for 11th place where I put The Runaway Bride. Sorry guys. The End of Time just about scrapes the top 10. I'm preparing myself to be called a fake fan for putting The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe at number 9. In 8th place I put Twice Upon a Time. I had mixed feelings about every story up until this point, but from 7th place onwards everything is great, and in that place is The Return of Dr Mysterio. Well, I woke up today and put The Christmas Invasion in 6th place. Voyage of the Damned makes it into the top 5. 4th place goes to Last Christmas. And now we're into the top 3. Those of you paying attention will know that it's one special for each Doctor, which I didn't plan, but I'm really glad it ended up that way. Getting the bronze medal is The Next Doctor, and I think it's incredible that a story that good can end up in 3rd place. It's a testament to the next two. In 2nd is A Christmas Carol, which means that my favourite Doctor Who Christmas special is The Husbands of River Song, and I hope I've done a good enough job of explaining why. I know that your rankings will probably vastly differ from mine, so let me know in the comments what order you'd put them in. I'm really interested to see what you think. You can probably tell that, on the whole, I'm a huge fan of these episodes. I think most of them are such lovely pieces of storytelling that bring together the magic of Christmas with the magic of Doctor Who. If you're wondering how big a part the fact that it's Christmas plays in these specials, the average score for Christmassiness was 3.5 Doctors out of 5, which is pretty festive. If you were wondering about the correlation between Christmassiness and quality, feast your eyes on this. I think that shows a general trend that Christmassier means better. You can't argue with data like that.
Having Doctor Who every year on Christmas Day was such a great tradition, and it's one I'm sad I was only part of for a few years. I hope we get it back. It's been such a joy revisiting these stories, and it's solidified my opinion that Doctor Who needs Christmas, and Christmas needs Doctor Who. I hope you had fun looking back through the years with me, and that you all have a very Merry Christmas. Love you lots.